Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me this week is Christopher Altomare, CEO of Nova Analytic Lab. Thank you very much for joining me today, Christopher.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Do you prefer Chris or Christopher?
Chris is fine.
Oh, very good. All right. Well, before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. Chris, I'd like to start with a little bit of background. So how was it that you got your start in the cannabis industry?
Yeah, so I got my start in the analytical field, doing testing in pharmaceutical toxicology and forensic space. So in a laboratory testing different biological and pharmaceutical compounds, and kind of around 2018 or so when cannabis really, the legalization wave started, I got an opportunity to do some consulting out west in some cannabis laboratories. And I quickly realized there was a real lack of professionals trained in analytical chemistry in the space. So business partners and I decided, well, we could stop doing this for other people and do it ourselves. And that's when we found an opportunity in Portland, Maine. They were just legalizing, getting ready for their adult use market, and needed some laboratories up there.
Coming from the pharma side of things, what was it like when you were consulting out on the West Coast? And did anything kind of raise your eyebrows a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, when I said lack of professionals in this space, I mean, really people did not have training in analytical chemistry. I've come into contact with a few laboratories back then that were being managed by people just finishing with a bachelor's degree, no experience running a production laboratory. And I saw, so my background comes from very highly regulated industries, and we're doing types of tests where if you got the result wrong, you could potentially harm or even injure, kill a person on the other end, right? So quality has always been the first and foremost in my mind. And I think laboratories were initially set up thinking, we could put an instrument there and it's going to print some money. Well, this is a very delicate technology, and you have to really stay on top and know how to operate these instruments to put out quality data. And that was really lacking.
So that was around 2018. Have you seen a transition to more professional labs overall in the industry?
Yeah, very much so. I think there used to be a lot of blatant fraud, and I think that's kind of come around now to a certain extent. I think it still happens, but to less, at least it's less obvious nowadays. We've all heard of lab shopping, and that still occurs, but I think people are doing it less blatantly, or we're truly starting to clean some of that up. I think the regulatory bodies are doing a better job of that now as well.
Okay, what are some of the examples of the less blatant fraud that we're seeing now?
Yeah, so I think some examples you might really still revolve around potency numbers. And I think some of it comes down to maybe not great science. And when I think a lot of the state regulating bodies they're better at regulating rules and policies and procedures as opposed to the actual science that is happening. So when they look at a methodology and they go to license that laboratory for it, they might not pick up on some of the technical aspects of those methods that aren't quite accurate. So one of the things that I've seen as an example is when we analyze cannabinoids, they're very similar compounds, and you do something called chromatographic analysis with a detector, either as a UV detector or a mass spec detector. Well, regardless, you have to separate these compounds individually through chromatography, because if they come out underneath of each other, they can influence one another's signal, and you can mismeasure them essentially. So Delta 9 and Delta 8, those are pretty prevalent compounds, and Delta 8 and Delta 9 on a chromatograph are very close to one another. If you don't separate them, you could identify Delta 8 as Delta 9, so on and so forth. Or even if there's a mixture of them, you might calculate the entire contents of that cannabinoid as a Delta 9, where it should have been Delta 8 or something like that. So kind of like the lack of understanding of the science kind of leads to the quality of the data being in jeopardy.
Okay. So when you and your partners decided to set up shop in Maine, what did you guys do to make sure that you were kind of bringing best practices to the industry?
Yeah, so we actually go above, in our laboratory, we go above and beyond what the state requires, for instance, for like QC requirements, the type of QCs that we run. We've taken a lot of what we've done in our methods from our previous roles in the toxicology, clinical laboratory space, and the pharmaceutical realm, where their QC is a little more stringent and a little more robust in the fact that it allows more real-time monitoring of your data throughout the process. Throughout in the laboratory, there's many things you have to QC, and that's where we make sure our procedures take into account the sample handling up front, the sample extraction and preparation, the instrumentation and operation of that instrument, and then the post data review, data entry, and all these other pieces. Some QC, you have to have different QC for each of those areas. We make sure we have dedicated QC and procedures in place to monitor all of those systems.
When you were starting Nova, were you more drawn to the ability to do it right, sort of be like a best in class, or was it to be your own boss?
A little bit of both. I definitely enjoy being the best at something. So I knew that we could build a better process and technology than most other labs are using right now. And I feel proud that we've really done that in Maine, and kind of really identified as like one of the more high-end and quality laboratories in the space.
Have you worked with Maine regulators at all just to try and give them a sort of a leg up in terms of what they're looking for when it comes to lab testing?
Yeah, they've actually been very collaborative with us over the years. They did a smart thing in that they have a kind of two-pronged licensing procedure for the labs. They have the Office of Cannabis Policy, which does all the licensing and policy elements, but they also have a certification program for the labs that they channel through the Maine Centers for Disease Control. So our regulators and inspectors in that space are actual chemists or microbiologists that help review the data. And they have, organized meetings with the laboratories in Maine and come together as a kind of a round table. Like, here's what we're trying to do. We don't really understand it. What are you seeing and how are you doing in your lab? And they've been very collaborative in that respect with us and in the industry as well.
So you were the first company to test for pesticides in Maine. Is that because you were one of the earliest to open your doors, or you saw a real lack of testing in the market?
Yeah, so we decided that we would launch our laboratory with all the tests available because we thought it was important for public health. A lot of the regulations were being developed at the time as we were trying to launch. We weren't really sure what was going to be required. What ended up happening was Maine launched their adult use market for various reasons, launched their adult use market without the required tests for metals, heavy metals, residual solvents, and pesticides. It wasn't up until, believe it or not, this last 2022, January 2020, January 2023, that the pesticides just became active. So we've been running with the market for about a year and a half, 2 years without those required tests. But, we've been testing them from the beginning, and folks that really cared about it were still doing that testing on the side so they could show their product was, safe. And
yeah, I mean, you say, what are some of those various reasons that they decided not to include that? Just because when it comes to testing for pesticides, that seems like sort of a base level testing.
So they were worried about the laboratories. So there was only 2 licensed laboratories at the time, ourselves and Nelson Analytical, and then another one came aboard called Cat Labs a little after, and we were the only lab that could test for it, and they were worried about lab capacity in the state. We told them we could easily handle it, but they still wanted to wait for second and third options, which in my mind, quite honestly, I thought it was a poor decision because public health should come before getting this stuff out to market, right? And I think there was a lot of there've been a lot of issues with the rollout and regulations in Maine, a lot of pushback from industry folks, and I think they were trying to be gentle about their inclusion of more and more rules, regulations, and expense due to testing.
Okay. In your opinion, how and why are operators still failing tests?
Good question. So I think for the most part, people are trying to do it correctly. And meaning they have good business practices, they're not using pesticides, they're not trying to get around something. They're just a lot of unknown inputs that go throughout this entire process. It's a several month process. Things can happen. We've for most of the adult use failures we see, medical and in Maine is not currently regulated, so that's a whole nother story. But in adult use testing, when someone flags for pesticides now, it's after they've been operating and they know how to cultivate and extract without introducing these things. It usually comes from some raw input that they had brought into their system that they didn't check. For instance, the soil, fertilizer. We've run into people just like starting a new facility, and during construction, the area was contaminated somehow. Molds, the cleaning procedures not done well enough. But we really partner with our clients. So when they have an issue, we'll go into their facility, we'll take samples of all those things, we'll swab, we'll help them get down to the bottom of it. And once that happens once or twice, they really lock into their procedures. They know what's coming in and going out, and they rarely have an issue again. Testing. That's just kind of our way of helping them help themselves.
Did you say that the medical side in Maine isn't regulated?
Yeah, how about that? Medical testing, the medical market I'm trying to think of the date, but was around before the adult use, right? And they have this market of caregivers, or several thousand of the couple, like 2,000 to 3,000, I think, caregivers now. And it was this very small sort of mom and pop sort of program initially, where a caregiver could have 5 or 6 patients and that's all they could sell to. But the rules and regulations for medical have changed drastically over the last few years, that, some medical producers now are as large as or bigger than adult use companies. So they've gone from like some of them have gone from small mom and pop to large business. And in the last couple of years, the Office of Cannabis Policy has tried to regulate medical by introducing testing, track and trace. But it was too much, too soon, too quick for the industry to sort of handle. And through legislative actions, they've blocked some of that. I understand there's going to be another attempt or another round of regulating. But yeah, up until this point, there are no testing requirements for Maine medical cannabis. We do get people that are trying to do the right thing and test and put tested product out on the shelves. But you can grow and sell to anyone with the medical card without having a tested product.
Okay, that makes no sense to me. And coming from a pharmaceutical background, I mean, honestly, that just seems, not that there should be a lack of regulation in the recreational market, but I feel like medical, that should be the one where you really have some checks and balances in place.
Yeah, kind of like it's counterintuitive to think medicine, not tested. The most important thing here is, we have immunocompromised people taking this material potentially, so molds and pesticides. And just, at the base level, you want consistency in your medicine. Every time I take my gummy or this product and I want 10 milligrams, I'm getting 10 milligrams, so I get the same effect. But yeah, it's just they've been able to block a lot of the regulations.
Is that what it's going to take to overcome these legislative blocks? Is a patient going to need to have a very serious interaction, or possibly like a fatality, in order for some real change to happen?
That would be a real shame, wouldn't it? I think the legislators I think the regulators now, there's a new head of the OCP, and I think that there is strong attention right now on getting this market regulated. To what success they will be able to do that, because the legislature has been very supportive of putting in passing business friendly laws as opposed to public health focused laws. But I think, if someone has to die to change a law, that's pretty sad, right? Let's not have to go there. But right now there's no clear path forward.
Are operators on the medical side also involved on the adult use side, or do they sort of stay separate just because it's kind of still the Wild West from a regulatory perspective?
Some people have maintained both license categories. They are able to do that. But I would say for the most part, people have shifted completely into adult use if they've done it.
Okay. Um, you had mentioned remediation. Um, do you have one preferred method of cannabis remediation when it comes to some of the products that are failing these tests?
So pesticides and heavy metals are very hard to remediate. And it also depends on the specific pesticide or chemical that is there. I think the easiest thing to remediate are for molds and bacteria. There's a lot of things you can do. Peroxide doesn't really work too much. Like different radiation techniques. The one that I've seen, I think the most successful and leaves the product still in its best sort of state afterwards, unchanged, is X-ray radiation because it's a little less. A lot of people have been using ozone, I think, and it's a reactive oxygen species, and that can really react. Also, it's non-specific. It really can react with the cannabinoids and terpenes. Sometimes the product looks a little brown after it, but the X-ray radiation, because it's can be tuned in a little more specific to the cells that you're trying to kill and less exposure time. I've seen the product after that, and it still looks like initial bud flower.
Okay. I mean, is it because people within the industry are more holistic, or it seems like there's a lot of pushback when it comes to X-ray remediation? Is it simply because of the name? Is it like a branding problem?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do you think people think it's like not safe because it's radiation? And
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a lack of understanding. I mean, it's like putting your carry-on through a TSA check. You're fine picking it up afterwards. It's not left. There's no residual radiation left behind, and you can't get cancer or anything through that exposure. Yeah, I think it's just a lack of understanding. Maybe they should rebrand the name.
When it comes to these failed tests, how often are you seeing them?
And we get them every day. We actually we're about to talk about some pesticide failure data that we looked at in the state of Maine, and there's a big discrepancy between the voluntary non-compliance data that we look at and the compliance data. We'll be releasing that in the next couple weeks. I can't talk about it right now, but there's a big discrepancy. Failures happen every day, but on the adult use side, where it is regulated and the operators are just operating in a more thought out procedural process because they have to, because if their test fails, their entire crop potentially has to be destroyed, right? Mm-hmm. They don't have those restrictions and requirements in the medical side. They could technically still sell it if they wanted to. So the failures sort of come up and then they subside for an individual for a specific licensing plateau. If I had to look at our overall failure rate, it's less than 10%, probably somewhere around 5% of samples every day that are failing.
Well, quite the cliffhanger. Please let us know when you can actually talk about that. Are these sort of, for lack of a better term, repeat offenders that are failing tests, or is it something that kind of hits every operator from time to time?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on, first of all, the products that people are producing. I think the more cyclical approach, like for instance, happens with cultivators and mold and bacterial exposure. When they have an issue, it like flares up for all their samples, and then we help them get it under control, and then they're good for a while. And then it might come back. Hopefully they've keep up with their cleaning procedures and it never comes back. And then you have like people manufacturing products, and they might leave a little butane behind, and that's like they get a spike here and there potentially. But usually, like I said, there's like almost like a training and a consistency that they start to get, and they stop failing. Period.
Okay. Some people within the industry think that maybe we should relax testing, and that it's too stringent right now in terms of threatening businesses and stuff. Is that the answer?
I definitely think there has been over-regulation in testing to a certain extent. In Maine, they used to have a rule where every time you transferred license types, you had to run a full compliance test. But now we have something called more final form testing, where it's just after the product is made in its final form. I could say that with air quotes because there's a few things that are not correct with our final form testing, but that principle is all the tests must be completed on the final product that's going to be sold to the consumer. And that's, I think, a good method of testing. Why test something initially, then manipulate it and retest it for the same thing? There is a caveat right now in Maine where they allow heavy metal testing and pesticide testing on flower material. And then you can process it down into a concentrate and not have to test it again. But the problem with that is if you test the flower material, the pesticide level might not be detectable. But once you concentrate it to 5-10x, all of a sudden you might see that pesticide there. Not to mention if your extraction equipment and all your handling processes are actually where the pesticide or heavy metal is introduced, the final form is not tested. So we have a little kind of issue, in my opinion, with the way we're doing final form testing. But I think overregulation has happened, but that's where it stops. I mean, understand testing is expensive, but we're talking about public health, patient health, and safety. And are you gonna, a quick buck for someone's health is, I think, not where we need to go in this industry. We're also, my position and kind of our role in this industry is to help legitimize the industry. I think there's been a lot of stigma around cannabis and this space in general, and our involvement in the results that we put out and the certification of all these of all this material going on shelves for people to buy gives some level of, comfort and legitimizes what we're doing here. Mm-hmm. If we were able to just grow anything, manufacture anything we want, put on the shelf, and people are getting sick, how would that harm the space?
Is the difference in medical and adult use testing widely known throughout the state? Just because if I'm a medical patient, I'm buying adult use cannabis to treat myself just because I feel like it's a safer product.
Yeah, there was actually a group, I forget the name of the group, in Maine about a year ago. They did a blind survey of patients, and it was something like less than 50 or around that 50% mark of people didn't realize that the cannabis they were buying from a medical dispensary wasn't tested.
Wow.
So it's not common knowledge.
And I guess you've answered this in a number of ways, but if you had to succinctly describe the state of the cannabis industry in Maine, how would you describe it?
I think there is a little turmoil going on right now. I think prices, I'm not too familiar with all this sort of data, but I know there's a lot of talk. Let me start with this. So our summer tourist season was very poor. So I think the adult use market has too much inventory. So prices have plummeted. Same with the medical cannabis. And there's been such a push for less regulation in the medical market and no track and trace. It's allowed the black market to kind of flourish. So I think the medical market is seeing competition there. So I think there's a recalibration that's happening and starting to go on.
Okay. Is part of this recalibration, is Maine in a better place now than it was when it first came online, or is it worse?
That's hard to say. I think we're definitely in a better place. I think our infrastructure to handle the market is much better now as well. Operators are making money, the ones that are doing it correctly. And I'm seeing companies grow. So I think that's a good sign.
When you look at other labs in different states, do you see an opportunity to grow and expand into other territories?
Yeah, actually, we just entered into a joint venture with a group called Certified Testing and Data, and we're opening a lab in Albany, New York together.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. We already have the lab pretty much built and probably shooting for opening in sometime in the late fall timeframe.
What have been some of the learning experiences working in the New York market?
Good question. We're like 2 or 3 months into it, so still learning a lot. One of the things, like all of the markets, I think they've had a rollout related issues, right? Not really knowing how and when things are going to happen. So that's going to be the trick, is to make sure we're open at the right time and not open too soon that we're sitting and waiting for samples and have a lot of overhead and, trying to manage a business without any revenue, as opposed to coming in too late. And, I'd say that when a client picks its lab, they pretty much stay with that lab. So you have to get in at the right time. It's like kind of akin to how often you change your primary care doctor. Not so much. Once you find the one you like, you kind of stick there.
Right. Or the one you can live with anyways.
Yeah, there you go.
Um, I guess some of the positive things coming, it looks like New York is actually going to go after or try to push out that black market or gray market. So that has to look good when it comes to testing for a more legitimate market.
Yeah, I mean that'll rise, give a rise to the whole the industry there as a whole. So that'll be good for us. Less black market weed on the market, right?
Does that ever come up where people are sending you samples and you think that maybe they have nefarious origins?
Um, we so in Maine, the law allows anyone to possess marijuana, so we don't really have to ask where it comes from. We do offer patients free testing that don't have tested marijuana or cannabis products. They can come in and get some free testing with us. So I'm sure we've tested some black market product.
Do patients take advantage of that service?
We're trying to get it out there, so people know about it more. We have a few people that consistently do it, but yeah, not as much as I'd hope. I'm really trying to help the patients here.
Okay. In June, you doubled proprietary terpene testing. Why'd you do that?
So, there are a lot of terpenes out there. There's a limited number that are actually in cannabis, but we try to expand our panel. The whole idea of buying the highest percent THC product off the shelf, and that's going to be the best one. I think in the more developed markets that people are starting to understand that is not what cannabis is. The effect is for much broader reasons than that. It's the terpenes, it's the flavonoids, it's all the other, it's a real chemical fingerprint and profile of the cannabis plant. And that's why we've increased our terpene panel so cultivators, manufacturers can help characterize their product to a more extent and offer maybe more be able to compete with other other processors that don't give that information. So someone can really go into a dispensary, look at the product on the shelf and look at the terpenes and say, I like the way that these made me feel, and have a larger profile to be able to do that with.
Going from the Maine market to the New York market, do you anticipate any growing pains, going into a market that could be multiples larger than the one you're currently in?
Not, I don't think so. We have a pretty good process, and my background, we're running about like anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 samples a month here in Maine. And I mean, my previous roles I've automated laboratories running 20, 30,000. So I have the experience for it. I'm actually really looking forward to it. When you get to that level and that throughput, you can really start to see efficiencies in a laboratory and scalability, which is exciting. My bread and butter in the laboratory is real automation and efficiency development. So I'm looking forward to that larger scale.
How do you stay on the forefront of the new equipment that's coming out, and when do you decide that the ROI is right to bring it in house?
So the ROI tends to be, can I get better data quicker and more accurately? That doesn't happen too often with the development of new instruments in our space. The development of new instruments tends to be pretty slow. They get a little more sensitive each year. They get a little more easier to operate. There haven't been huge innovations in the type of analytical chemistry we're using. The innovations tend to happen around the sample preparation and before it gets to the instrument. So that's really where the science has developed the most in cannabis. We still have the same mass specs. We still have the same types of GCs. We still have the same PCR we're using, but it's all the little solutions and things that we're doing up to the sample in front of that instrument that have really developed. The cannabis science is new, and that's kind of what's exciting me about it, is developing these new methods and honing the technology to get that best answer as fast as possible in front of us.
What's some of the equipment that you have in house that you just couldn't live without?
Yeah, so when we talk about pesticide analysis, we're running high resolution or LCMS triple quad. also for cannabinoids, they can be run there, or something called usually you hear people call it an HPLC. That's really a chromatograph with a type of UV type detector on the end. For terpenes and headspace, or sorry, terpenes and residual solvent analysis is run on something called a GCMS. It's where we're looking at molecules in the gaseous state. Still run those through a chromatograph and detect them on the end with a mass spec device. And there's many configurations of all these equipment, but I'm kind of just running through what we have. For heavy metals analysis, this is done on something called an ICP-MS. Mm-hmm. So these are all different introduction techniques into a mass spectrometer. This uses a plasma that superheats the infusion material, and we look for elemental compounds. And then there's culture-based and PCR-based technologies for looking at microbes. Culture-based to do your total counts, and PCR, which is super sensitive to look at even the presence of one cell, which could be a pathogenic Salmonella or coli.
Okay. When it comes to making this specific equipment, are there any manufacturers that are focusing on the needs of the cannabis industry, or is it that equipment from other industries are kind of filling the need so far?
Yeah, no, the three big ones, Agilent, Shimatsu, and AB SciEx now really have focused on the cannabis space the most. So they have Agilent and Shimatsu, for instance, have like a whole suite that you can say, give me that, and they'll give you everything you need to run a cannabis lab pretty much.
Do you have a personal connection to the industry at all?
Yeah, I was always I started this journey when I was fairly young and new to, it was my first attempt to open a business, and the community is what drew me into it and give me that opportunity to explore the different the different options. So when we were out west, I made a lot of friends going through to these laboratories, experiencing what not to do, what to do, and how to do it. So that's been.
Does that community still exist on the lab side, or is it getting so competitive that everyone kind of has their proprietary practices in place?
Yeah, it's still I think it's starting to silo a little bit.
Okay. What are your expectations when it comes to federal legalization? And is that something, in your opinion, how's that going to change the industry?
The question is when, right? Not if. I think descheduling will happen eventually. 3 to 5 years, probably the absolute earliest, in my opinion. And that's kind of what I kind of alluded to, the fact that it kind of came from that FDA pharmaceutical space. And we've really set up our lab and methodologies to be kind of flip of the switch. We can operate under FDA regulations. It's going to be interesting to see how they regulate, and if they allow. They deschedule it and allow states to still manage, or they put in some guidelines of minimum or best practices. But the FDA likes a lot more regulation, and it's much more costly. So it will be, I think, it'll really cause some turmoil in the space when it finally happens. It'll open up interstate markets, but the testing, where does the testing have to happen? Do you need a test in every state you sell in? Can one lab be in one location be authorized for multiple states? A lot of those questions still would remain.
Okay. As you were going through school and before you were a professional, could you have ever guessed that you were going to be a cannabis professional?
No, I had no idea.
Would you have done it any differently?
Yeah, I mean, there's always things you would have done a little differently. I think I would have been a little less. I think we had high hopes initially for how quick everything would happen, and I think I would have been able to meter my expectations on the speed of how the market and the business would develop. I'm happy where it's ended up, and we've got to where we wanted to go, and I just wish I would have metered my expectations there a little bit.
Working on New York next, any other states that Nova might be looking to expand into?
Evaluating every day. I had my eyes initially on Arizona for a little while, but I think there's some things to work out there. Nevada is still interesting to me. So every day talking to people and labs out there. There's a lot of labs on the market for sale right now too. So we're looking at those opportunities.
Okay. There have been a couple of movements from within the industry to gain a little bit more cannabis-specific certification for labs. Do you think like industry pushed efforts like that are good for the industry? Do you think that'll help kind of raise the bar when it comes to lab performance?
Yeah, standardization is something that we're very used to in the lab space across every industry, and it's needed. We need to find we need at least a list of minimum standards that you have to be able to hit, right? When I validate something, a methodology, what's the minimum number of replicates I should be looking at to make sure I have consistent, reproducible results? I've seen things that are still being done that are just, it's not science, in my opinion, not good science anyways.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time with me today, Chris. I really do appreciate it. But before we get out of here, is there anything else that you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience knows about yourself or about Nova Lab?
Yeah, this is a message for cultivators and manufacturers when you're looking for a laboratory. One piece of advice I like to give those individuals is ask your laboratory for the raw data. If you want to know if your lab is doing the right thing, even if you don't understand that data, they can help walk you through it. But if you ever encounter a laboratory that says to you, I don't give my raw data, I don't give my chromatograms, walk away from that laboratory, because in my mind, what we're doing and a chromatograph that they're going to show you is not going to give away proprietary information. They can sit down, they can explain their process and their data, that you make you feel comfortable that you're getting quality results on the other end.
Does that happen a lot where they don't want to give away the raw data?
I've heard from clients that, yeah, that does happen. And it just, with all the air quotes again here, shadiness going on in the space, or at least some people still look at the lab space as having that issue. This is one way that us lab operators that are trying to do the right thing can get around that and help change the perception.
Excellent. Well, Chris, thank you again for taking the time, and I hope we get a chance to do it again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Well, before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter and make sure you get it delivered to the inbox first. All right. For Christopher Altomare, CEO of Nova Analytical Lab, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.